My name is Evelyn Marrow, and I am 82 years old. If you flip through the thick leather photo albums stacked in my living room, you'll see decades of smiles. There I am at Thanksgiving, standing next to my husband, Richard, carving the turkey with his strong hands. There I am at weddings, in pale dresses with corsages pinned to my chest, smiling like the perfect wife. There I am at Christmas, framed by tinsel and twinkling lights, holding his arm as if nothing in the world could ever break us. But if you look closer, if you really stare, you'll see it. My smile never touched my eyes. People never noticed. Why would they? In family photos, everyone's eyes dart straight to the children or the bride or the baby. No one ever stopped to study me, to ask why my lips curved upward but my eyes remained flat, dark, almost pleading. I thought I'd take that secret to my grave. For 60 years I played the part, tucked the truth behind polite nods and carefully applied lipstick. But on my 82nd birthday, the day everything changed, I found myself standing in front of my entire family, trembling with rage and relief, finally telling them why. It didn't start with an explosion. Betrayals rarely do. It was a whisper, a casual cruelty, something so small it could have slipped past me, if I hadn't already carried decades of pain beneath my skin. It was late September. The air in our Michigan town thick with the smell of wood smoke and the first hint of autumn leaves. My granddaughter Clara had planned a surprise party for me. 82 years old, and she still thought surprises were delightful. Balloons in muted gold and cream, a cake with buttercream roses, laughter spilling from the backyard. I remember walking out onto the patio, wrapped in a shawl, and hearing them before they saw me. "She's so stubborn," Richard was saying, his voice low though not low enough. "Always has been. You know, I could have had a different life if not for her." The words sliced through the evening air, sharper than the chill creeping in with the dusk. Clara gasped softly. "Grandpa, don't say that." But he wasn't done. He never knew when to stop. "It's true. I married her because it was the right thing to do at the time. But look at me now. 84 and shackled to a woman who still thinks lemon pie is the height of sophistication. She drained the life out of me years ago." The world tilted. I gripped the back of a wicker chair to steady myself, my knuckles whitening. My chest felt tight, like every breath was fighting to escape. I had spent 60 years standing beside that man, raising his children, smoothing his shirts, pretending his coldness was just how men are. I endured his dismissals, his sharp silences, his endless reminders that I was lucky he stayed. And all the while I told myself the sacrifice was worth it. For the family, for stability, for the image we maintained. But hearing him say it aloud, in front of our granddaughter, was different. It wasn't just a private cruelty anymore. It was a declaration, an unveiling. I turned, my shawl slipping from my shoulders, and walked into the light. Conversations hushed. Someone clapped awkwardly. "Surprise, Grandma." Richard's face froze, his lips pulling into the same polished smile he'd worn in every photograph. For a moment, I wondered if he even realized I'd heard. But the truth was written across his expression. Annoyance, not guilt. He was irritated that I'd arrived at the wrong time, interrupted his little confession. I forced myself to smile. My lips curved, my cheeks lifted, but inside something shattered. The evening carried on as parties do. Cake was cut. Candles were blown out. Children squealed over dripping ice cream cones. But inside me a storm raged. Every polite laugh I gave, every thank you for a gift, was a thread in the fragile fabric of a mask I no longer wanted to wear. When Richard leaned close to whisper, "Don't make a scene, Evelyn," I finally knew. I wasn't going to die with my truth buried. That night, after everyone left, I sat alone at the kitchen table. The house was still, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant creak of the settling roof. My shawl lay crumpled on the counter. In front of me sat the half-eaten cake, the word 82 written in looping script across the frosting. Richard had gone to bed, slipping under the covers without a word. For years I had followed him, dutifully, silently, as though climbing into the bed beside him erased the day's cruelties. But not that night. I sat with my hands folded, staring at the cake until the candles melted into crooked stubs. My heart hammered with something I hadn't felt in decades: resolve. The next morning I rose before the sun. I showered, dressed in a crisp blouse and dark slacks, and pinned my silver hair into a neat twist. I looked into the mirror, studying the lines carved into my face, the faint sag of my skin. And for the first time in years I let myself see it. Not just age but endurance. Downstairs I brewed coffee, the aroma filling the kitchen. Richard shuffled in, rubbing his eyes, muttering about the newspaper. He didn't notice the fire in my gaze. He never did. "Evelyn," he said, yawning, "don't forget we have the family photo this weekend. Clara booked the photographer." I almost laughed. Another photo. Another frame to hang on the wall. Another image of us standing side by side, smiling as though 60 years of rot didn't sit beneath the surface. I stirred my coffee slowly, then met his eyes. "Richard," I said, my voice steady, "do you ever wonder why my smile never reached my eyes?" He blinked, taken aback. "What the hell are you talking about?" I didn't answer. Not then. Not yet. The day of the photo shoot arrived. It was held at a local botanical garden, rows of late-season roses still clinging to their blooms. The whole family gathered. Our son David with his wife, our daughter Marianne with her brood of teenagers, Clara with her little ones tugging at her skirt. The photographer, a young man with too much gel in his hair, positioned us beneath an arch of ivy. "Closer," he said cheerfully. "Big smiles, everyone." I felt Richard's arm brush mine. His hand slid to my waist, the gesture possessive, rehearsed. The same stance he had struck in every portrait since the 60s. Smiled. Or rather, I arranged my mouth into the shape of a smile. But my eyes burned with a truth I could no longer hide. The shutter clicked. Once. Again. And then, before the photographer could lower his camera, I stepped forward. "Wait," I said, my voice carrying across the garden. The family stilled. Children froze mid-giggle. Richard frowned. "Evelyn, what are you?" I turned to them, to all of them, my hands trembling but my spine straight. "For decades," I began, "you've seen me in photos, smiling beside this man. And maybe you thought we were happy. Maybe you thought my life was simple, easy, blessed. But what you didn't see was the truth. What you didn't see was why my smile never reached my eyes." Gasps rippled through the group. Richard's face darkened, his mouth opening to protest. But I wasn't finished. Not anymore. The words were perched on the edge of my tongue, 60 years of silence ready to break. And as I looked at the faces of my children, my grandchildren, even the stranger behind the camera, I realized there would be no turning back. My secret was about to spill into the light, and once it did, nothing, not family, not appearances, not Richard's carefully built facade, would ever be the same again. Hang on, before I tell you what happened next, make sure you've subscribed and left your thoughts in the comments. This part gets intense. When you've spent 60 years with someone, people assume you know them. They assume you share the same breath, the same heartbeat, the same pulse of memory. But the truth is, I knew Richard less with every passing year. The man who held my hand at 22 was not the man who stood beside me at 84. Or maybe he was the same all along and I just refused to see it. I met Richard Marrow in the spring of 1963. I was 19, working part-time at the county library, stamping due dates onto card inserts and dusting shelves lined with encyclopedias no one ever borrowed. He came in one rainy afternoon, tall, broad-shouldered, with a clean white shirt plastered damp against his chest. His hair was slicked back, his smile wide, And when he asked me where to find books on international finance, I was too flustered to notice that he didn't even check one out. What I did notice was how he looked at me. I wasn't used to being looked at that way, like I was a prize someone wanted to win. My parents adored him. He came from a good family, with money in the bank and a promising job lined up at his uncle's firm. He drove a Chevrolet Impala that gleamed even on cloudy days. Compared to the shy boys who hung around the library, Richard seemed like a man already halfway to the future. When he asked me to marry him a year later, I said yes. Everyone said I'd be foolish not to. The cracks, though, they appeared early. On our honeymoon in Florida, I remember standing on a balcony overlooking the ocean, sunlight painting the water in gold. I turned to Richard, eager to share the beauty, but he didn't look. He was fiddling with his watch, muttering about how the waiter had been too slow with breakfast. "It's always like this," he said. "People don't respect your time." I laughed nervously, tried to pull him close, but he stiffened. "Evelyn, don't wrinkle my shirt." I told myself it didn't matter. Everyone said marriage was about compromise, about smoothing over the small things. But the small things piled up. By our 5th anniversary, Richard had mastered the art of subtle dismissals. He'd wave off my opinions with a chuckle. "That's cute, Evelyn, but you don't understand how the world works." When I suggested we try for another child after David, he shook his head. "One is enough. We don't need to stretch ourselves thin because of your whims." When I baked a pie for his colleagues, he smiled politely in front of them, then whispered later, "Next time, don't embarrass me with something so rustic." Each time I swallowed the sting. I told myself he was just practical, just proud, just tired from work. I told myself all men were like that. That love was about endurance. And when my parents passed, one after the other, Richard was the one who signed the paperwork, arranged the funerals, shook hands with relatives. He stood beside me like a sturdy oak, unyielding, and I mistook his efficiency for devotion. But inside I was already shrinking. The years blurred into photographs. Birthdays, school plays, graduations. My son David grew tall, his laughter filling the house. His eyes carrying a kindness I couldn't find in his father. But even as I poured myself into motherhood, Richard remained distant. He provided, yes, there was always food on the table, a roof over our heads. But affection, softness, the little moments of tenderness that stitch a marriage together, those vanished like smoke. I remember one winter night in 1978, when the furnace broke during a snowstorm. I curled beneath blankets, teeth chattering, while David snored softly in the next room. I whispered to Richard, "Come close. Let's keep warm together." He scoffed. "Don't be ridiculous. I'm fine." So I lay there, trembling, inches from his body but miles from his warmth. That was when I first realized, you can be married and still feel desperately alone. By the 1980s, Richard's career had flourished. He wore tailored suits, carried a leather briefcase, and spent more nights at the office than at home. When he did return, it was with the weight of unspoken judgments. "Evelyn, the curtains are dated. Replace them. Why don't you do something useful with your time? Everyone else's wife is busy with charity boards. Stop hovering over me. It's suffocating." I learned to tiptoe around him, to measure my words like teaspoons of sugar. When friends asked how we were, I smiled. "He's doing well at work. We're very proud." And when the camera flashed at family gatherings, I lifted my lips into that perfect practiced smile. No one ever asked why my eyes looked so tired. There were warning signs, of course. Glimpses of the truth beneath his polished facade. Once, at a neighborhood barbecue, I overheard Richard laughing with another man. "Marriage. It's about appearances. As long as she plays her part, I play mine." When he noticed me listening, he gave me that same infuriating smile. "Evelyn, fetch us another round of beers, will you?" He obeyed. Because what else could I do? Divorce was unthinkable back then, at least in our circle. Women who left were whispered about, pitted, shunned. So I stayed. I convinced myself that stability was love. But the truth dug into me like splinters, small at first, then festering. As David grew, I feared he would inherit his father's coldness. But he didn't. He became gentle, patient, the kind of man who kissed his wife's cheek in the kitchen and bent down to listen to his children's stories. When I asked him once, "Where did you learn to love like that?" he smiled softly. "From you, Mom." His words pierced me. Because even as I smiled, pride swelling, I wondered if he'd also noticed what I endured. And then came the photos. Always the photos. Richard insisted we document every holiday, every milestone. He liked the image it projected. The successful husband, the devoted wife, the smiling family. I remember one picture in particular, taken at our 50th anniversary party. The whole family gathered in a rented hall, a cake the size of a small car, champagne flutes clinking. The photographer posed us beneath a banner that read, 50 Years of Love. As the camera clicked, Richard squeezed my waist, whispering, "Smile wider, Evelyn. Don't ruin the shot." So I smiled. But my eyes told another story. And now, as I stood decades later in that botanical garden, about to break the silence, I thought of that photograph. I thought of every forced grin, every hollow moment, every whispered command to smile wider. That September morning in the garden, as I faced my family, I felt the weight of all those years pressing on my chest. My children, my grandchildren, they had no idea. To them, I was just Grandma Evelyn, the woman who baked pies and sent birthday cards with crisp $20 bills tucked inside. But they were about to learn who I really was. Because the truth wasn't just about Richard's cruelty. It was about my silence. For 60 years I let him shape the narrative. I let the photographs tell a story that wasn't mine. But not anymore. Before we go any further, click subscribe and let me know in the comments. What would you have done in my shoes? Grandma! Clara's voice trembled as she stepped closer. What do you mean? I opened my mouth, the words rushing forward. Decades of buried pain clawing their way to the surface. But Richard cut in. His voice was sharp, commanding, the same tone he'd used on me for half a century. Enough, Evelyn. Don't embarrass yourself. I turned to him slowly. For the first time in my life, I met his gaze without flinching. And in that moment I realized something that made my breath catch. The cracks in our marriage weren't just fractures. They were fault lines. And the earthquake was coming. Before we move on, take a second to hit subscribe and drop a comment. I'd love to hear what you think so far. They say betrayal feels like a knife in the back. That isn't true. Slower, heavier. Like sinking into cold water and realizing you can't breathe. But the world around you keeps moving as if nothing's wrong. Standing in that garden, facing my family, I felt the edges of that truth pressing in. But I hadn't even touched the deepest wound yet. Not the secret that had burned through my life like acid, unseen by anyone else. It started decades ago, though I only put the pieces together recently. Richard's betrayals weren't just in the sharp words or the dismissive glances. They weren't only in the way he told others I'd trapped him, or how he treated my loyalty like cheap wallpaper to decorate his life. The real betrayal was in what he took from me, year after year, while I smiled beside him in those photographs. I remember one afternoon in 1972. Our son David was 9, away at a friend's house. I was folding laundry when the phone rang. "Mrs. Marrow?" A woman's voice asked. "This is Linda from First National Bank. I just wanted to confirm your husband's withdrawal for the lake property." Froze. "I'm sorry, what?" "Lake property," she repeated. "The down payment was processed today. I assumed you knew. When Richard came home I asked him about it. He laughed. "Evelyn, you must have misheard. There's no lake property. He kissed my cheek, dropped his briefcase by the door, and asked what was for dinner. I wanted to believe him. And I did. For years. Because that's what I always did. I believed the story he gave me, even when it didn't feel right. The truth clawed its way to the surface much later, long after David had grown, after grandchildren filled the house with shrieks and sticky fingers. It was in the spring of my 75th year. I was cleaning the attic when I found a box shoved behind old suitcases. Inside were papers. Deeds, receipts, letters. Proof that Richard had bought a cottage by a lake 2 hours away. A cottage I had never seen. And in those letters addressed to him was the second knife. They weren't from me. They were from a woman named Lillian. The earliest letter dated back to 1971. The handwriting was neat, looping, filled with tenderness. She wrote about weekends at the cottage, about dinners they shared, about the way you make me feel seen. One letter read, "I don't mind being your secret. I just hate that she doesn't know she's the one in the way." I sat on the attic floor, my hands trembling so badly the paper nearly tore. My entire life, my entire marriage, rewritten in ink before my eyes. The worst part wasn't that he'd had another woman. It wasn't even that he'd used our money, our security, to fund their hidden life. The worst part was the photographs. I thought of every anniversary, every Christmas, every staged family portrait where he pressed his hand to my waist while smiling for the camera. And I realized, those photos weren't lies to him. They were shields, proof to the world that he was respectable, devoted, untouchable. Meanwhile, I was nothing but a prop. For years I said nothing. I tucked the letters back into the box, shoved it into the attic, and tried to convince myself it wasn't real, that it was too late to matter. But every time I stood beside him for another photograph, every time he whispered, "Smile wider, Evelyn," I felt the burn of that truth searing deeper. By the time I turned 82, the weight of it had hollowed me out. So, when I overheard him at my birthday party, telling Clara he'd wasted his life with me, I knew the silence had to end. Now, in that botanical garden, my family staring at me with wide, bewildered eyes, the words tumbled out before I could stop them. "Do you want to know why my smile never reached my eyes?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Because for 60 years, I have been standing beside a man who lied to me. A man who used me. A man who built a second life behind my back and paraded me around like a trophy to keep the world fooled." Gasps rippled through the air. My daughter Marianne stepped forward, her face pale. "Mom, what are you talking about?" I turned toward Richard, who stood stiff, his jaw clenched. "Tell them," I said. "Tell them about the cottage. Tell them about Lillian." The silence that followed was louder than any shout. Richard's face twisted. "You're delusional," he spat. "Old age is rotting your brain. Don't listen to her." But I saw the flicker in his eyes. The panic he couldn't mask. And I knew I wasn't crazy. I described the letters. The deeds. The years of lies. My voice cracked, but I didn't stop. "While I cooked your meals, raised your son, hosted your colleagues, you were spending our money on her. You had a whole other life while I was smiling beside you in photos I thought meant something. 60 years, Richard. 60 years of me pretending while you lived a lie." Clara covered her mouth. David's fists clenched at his sides. Marianne whispered something I couldn't hear. But Richard, he laughed. A sharp, bitter sound. "You stupid woman," he said. "Do you think anyone cares? Do you think dragging this into the open will change anything? They'll believe me. They always do." The words sliced me open. Because deep down I feared he was right. The photographer lowered his camera, wide-eyed. My grandchildren clung to their mothers. My son looked torn between rage and disbelief. And me. Felt small. Smaller than I ever had. Because in that moment, after everything I'd said, Richard still held the power. He knew how to twist, how to gaslight, how to turn the narrative until I looked like the villain. I had finally spoken the truth, but it didn't feel like freedom. Felt like drowning. That night, back in our house, I sat again at the kitchen table, the same place where my resolve had first sparked after my birthday. But this time the fire felt dimmed. Richard stormed upstairs, muttering about hysterical old women. I sat in the dark, staring at the box I had dragged down from the attic. The letters spread across the table like ghosts. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. For decades I had endured silence. Now I had spoken, and still it wasn't enough. My family looked at me with pity, confusion, even doubt. The truth was out, but I was more alone than ever. As the clock ticked past midnight, I whispered to the empty kitchen, "What have I done?" Because deep inside, I knew Richard wasn't finished. He would fight back. He would twist the truth, bury me beneath his lies once more. And if I wanted justice, if I wanted them to finally see me, I couldn't stop here. I would have to fight. Before we go any further, click subscribe and let me know in the comments. What would you have done in my shoes? People think revenge is loud. They imagine screaming matches, broken plates, slammed doors. But real revenge, the kind that carves its mark so deep it cannot be erased, begins in silence. That night, after I laid out those letters on the kitchen table, I didn't shout. I didn't storm into the bedroom and throw them at Richard's face. I sat in the dark and let the silence seep into my bones until it hardened into something sharper than grief. Because grief makes you crumble. But silence can be sharpened into a blade. Richard believed he had one. He went to bed smug and unbothered, convinced that no one would believe the hysterical old woman. He had decades of practice in twisting reality until I questioned my own memory. And maybe 4 years he had succeeded. But not anymore. I was old, yes. 82, with brittle bones and wrinkled skin. But I was also free in ways I hadn't been before. What could he threaten me with now? My reputation. I had nothing left to prove. My marriage. It was already ashes. And that freedom gave me something precious. Fearlessness. The first step was evidence. I gathered everything from the attic. The deeds, the letters, the receipts. I tucked them into a binder, slipping each piece into clear plastic sleeves. My hands shook, but my purpose didn't. For the first time in decades, I was no longer burying the truth. I was curating it, preparing it for an audience. The letters were detailed, intimate. Lillian had written about dinners on the dock, about our little lake house, about Richard's promises to her. She mentioned dates that matched times he'd told me he was working late. She described gifts he'd given her. Bracelets, silk scarves that I had never seen. It was all there. Proof I hadn't been mad. Proof I hadn't imagined the distance in his eyes. The second step was control. Richard thrived on controlling the narrative. Every family photo, every dinner toast, every polished smile. It was all about maintaining the image of the devoted husband. So I asked myself, where did he value control the most? Where would losing it hurt him? The answer came easily. Richard didn't just love appearances. He lived for them. He needed to be admired, respected, envied. And if I stripped that from him, not in whispers, not in private confrontations, but in a way he couldn't twist, then he would finally feel the humiliation he had forced me to swallow for 60 years. I spent weeks quietly preparing. During the day I played the part as always. I made tea, clipped coupons, asked Richard if he wanted the good chair by the television. He sneered sometimes, suspicious of my compliance, but he dismissed it. In his mind I was too old, too broken, too dependent to pose a threat. At night, after he fell asleep, I planned. I wrote down every detail I wanted to expose. I practiced reading the letters aloud until my voice no longer trembled. I researched on the computer Clara had set up for me last Christmas. I learned how to scan documents, how to save them to a flash drive. My granddaughter had thought I'd only use it for recipes. She didn't know I was building a weapon. But revenge is not just planning. It is patience. And patience is something an old woman has in abundance. One evening, I watched Richard fall asleep in his recliner, the glow of the television casting shadows across his face. I studied him the way I might study a stranger on the street. His jawline had softened. His once powerful frame slackened with age. But his arrogance remained untouched, stitched into the very fabric of him. I whispered so softly he couldn't hear, "Your time is coming." And for the first time I almost smiled. Not the hollow, forced smile from the photos. A real smile, small but sharp. A seed of something I hadn't felt in years. Power. The opportunity presented itself sooner than I expected. Every year, the Marrow family held a reunion. It wasn't my idea. It was Richard's pride and joy. He loved gathering everyone at the country club, boasting about his children and grandchildren, parading me beside him like a medal he had earned. This year, Clara had taken charge of the details. She booked the ballroom, ordered the catering, even arranged for a slideshow of family photos to play on a screen throughout the evening. Slideshow. Photos. The very thing Richard had used to cage me for 60 years. And suddenly, I knew exactly where my revenge would land. I began working with Clara under the guise of helping with preparations. She was grateful, handing me access to the slideshow files so I could pick out some of the older photographs. She didn't know that as I flipped through those smiling images, I was weaving in something darker. I scanned the letters, the receipts, the deeds. A picture of the lake cottage I found online, still listed under Richard's name. And I inserted them carefully, strategically, between the smiling family portraits. Click. My wedding photo, Richard in his suit, me in white lace. Click. The deed to the lake cottage, dated months after our wedding. Click. David's graduation photo. Click. Lillian's letter. You make me feel alive in ways she never could. The contrast was devastating. Perfect. Every night, I rehearsed the speech I would give. Not long, not rambling. Just enough to pierce. Because revenge, I realized, wasn't about shouting. It was about precision. It was about taking the very thing Richard valued most, his image, and shattering it in front of the people whose admiration he craved. But there was risk. What if they didn't believe me? What if Richard spun it, convinced them I had gone senile? He had planted that seed already. I knew I needed more than words. I needed impact. Proof they couldn't unsee. That slideshow would be my weapon. But my voice would be the strike. The night before the reunion, I barely slept. I sat in the guest room, binder open on my lap, whispering my speech into the silence. My heart pounded, my throat dry, but I pressed on. Every time doubt whispered, "You're too old. No one will listen. He'll bury you again," I drowned it out with another truth. I had already spent 60 years in silence. Another moment of it would kill me. The morning of the reunion, I dressed with care. A navy dress, pearls at my neck, silver hair pinned neatly. I looked in the mirror and thought, this is not the face of a victim. This is the face of a survivor. Richard came downstairs in his suit, grumbling about traffic. He glanced at me, then back at his watch. "Don't cause a scene today," he muttered. I smiled at him. And for the first time in decades, the smile reached my eyes. The country club ballroom sparkled with chandeliers, white tablecloths, glasses of champagne. Family members bustled about, hugging, laughing, taking selfies for social media. The slideshow flickered on a large screen at the front, starting with childhood photos. Richard basked in it all. He shook hands, bragged about David's job, Marianne's children, Clara's volunteer work. He introduced me, as always, as my lovely wife, Evelyn. Played along. Now, But inside, I counted the minutes until the slideshow reached the part one had altered. I positioned myself near the front, binder clutched in my lap. My palms were damp, my chest tight, but my resolve was steel. And then I heard it, the shift in the room. Blick. Our wedding photo. Smiling faces. Blick. The deed to the lake cottage. Confused murmurs. Blick. David's graduation. Blick. Lillian's letter. Richard's head whipped toward the screen, his face blanching. I rose slowly, every eye turning toward me. This was the moment. The culmination of 60 years of silence. "Do you see?" said my voice firm, clear. For decades, I smiled in photographs beside this man. But those smiles were lies. Behind every one of them, he was living another life. With her. At the cottage. With our money. With my trust. The room was frozen. My grandchildren stared. Marianne pressed her hand to her mouth. David's face twisted with fury. And Richard finally looked small. He lunged toward the podium, spitting. "Shut it off. Shut it off now." But it was too late. The truth was out. I should have felt triumph in that moment. But instead I felt something else, something heavier. Because revenge is not clean. It is not a single strike and then peace. It is a flood that once unleashed cannot be contained. And as Richard's voice roared across the ballroom, as the family erupted in chaos, I realized this was only the beginning. The ballroom had never known such silence. For a moment after the letter flashed across the screen, time seemed to stop. Forks hovered above plates. Champagne glasses trembled in hands. Children stilled, their laughter dying on their lips. And then chaos. Gasps, whispers, rising voices. A ripple of disbelief swept the room, followed by anger, confusion, outrage. All the while, Richard's face blazed red as he lunged toward the projector. "Turn it off," he barked. His voice cracked with the desperation of a man losing his grip on the world he'd spent decades building. But the damage was done. The screen flickered again, showing another letter. "I don't mind being your secret, Richard. But I hate that she doesn't know she's the one in the way." The words glowed like fire. "Dad!" David's voice cut through the noise. It was sharp, trembling, but loud enough to silence the room. My son, our son, stood tall, fists clenched at his sides, his eyes burning into Richard. "Is it true?" Richard stammered. "David, listen. Don't you dare," David spat. "Don't you dare lie to me right now." I had never seen my son look at his father that way. Not with admiration. Not with disappointment. With disgust. It pierced me, and yet, for the first time, I felt less alone. Richard turned to me then, eyes narrowed like daggers. "You did this." His voice was a growl. "You think humiliating me makes you strong? You've destroyed this family." I rose from my chair, binder still clutched in my hand. My knees trembled, but my voice did not. "No, Richard," I said. "You destroyed this family 60 years ago. All I did was show them the truth." The murmurs in the room rose louder. Marianne shook her head, tears streaking her cheeks. Clara clutched her daughter close. My grandchildren stared at me with wide, bewildered eyes. And Richard, his mask cracked. The confident, polished man who had strutted through life with a smirk now stood exposed, cornered, desperate. He tried to laugh, but the sound was hollow. "So what if I had someone else? Do you think any of this matters now? She's long gone. Chose this family. Stayed. That's what matters." But no one was nodding. No one was smiling. They were staring at him the way people stare at a stranger. And in that moment I saw it. The collapse of the image he had clung to for decades. I walked to the center of the room, binder in hand, and placed it on the table in front of him. The clear sleeves gleamed beneath the chandeliers. Deeds, receipts, letters, proof. "You told me to smile wider, Richard." I said, my voice steady. You told me appearances were everything. But today I took back my smile. And I gave them yours, the real one. The one you've been hiding. Gasps echoed again as the slideshow flicked to the final image. A photograph of Richard and me on our 50th anniversary. He gripped my waist, smiling for the camera, while my eyes stared out hollow. But next to it, I had placed a line from one of Lillian's letters. You said you wished she would just disappear so we could finally be free. The juxtaposition was devastating. The ballroom erupted. Marianne sobbed openly. David turned away from his father. Clara shook her head in disbelief. The grandchildren whispered to each other, their voices carrying words I couldn't make out. Liar, hypocrite, cheat. Richard's voice boomed over the noise, ragged and broken. Enough. Enough of this circus. He slammed his fist on the table. The champagne glasses rattled, one tipping and spilling across the white cloth. But his fury couldn't put the truth back in the box. For decades I had been the silent one, the obedient wife, the smiling prop. Now I was the voice that couldn't be silenced. He tried one last time to claw his way back. He pointed at me, his hand shaking. She's lying. She's senile. She's always been fragile, emotional. You know how women get. But this time no one believed him. David's voice cut through like a blade. Stop. Just stop. His eyes brimmed with tears as he looked at me. Mom, why didn't you tell us sooner? My throat tightened. For a moment words failed me. And then softly I said, because I thought protecting you was more important than protecting myself. But I was wrong. The room was silent again, save for the quiet sobs of Marianne and the clicking of the slideshow as it ended on a blank screen. The aftermath was not neat. Never is. Richard stormed out of the ballroom, slamming the doors so hard the chandeliers trembled. Half the family followed, others lingered in stunned silence. Me. I stayed seated, my hands folded in my lap, the binder beside me like a shield. For the first time in 60 years, I wasn't pretending. In the days that followed, the fallout spread like wildfire. David called me every day. His voice filled with both sorrow and love. Marianne came by, her hands trembling as she hugged me longer than she ever had before. Clara sat at my kitchen table, tears in her eyes, whispering, "Grandma, I had no idea." And Richard, he moved into the lake cottage. Alone. The woman he had built it for was long gone. And now so was the family's respect. One evening, weeks later, I sat again in front of my mirror. The same lines creased my face. The same silver crowned my head. But this time when I smiled, I saw something new reflected back. Strength. Because my smile finally reached my eyes. I thought revenge would taste sweet. But it wasn't sweetness I felt. It was something stronger. Justice. Freedom. For decades, I was erased in my own marriage. Reduced to a background character in the story Richard wanted the world to believe. But at 82 I rewrote the ending. The last time I saw Richard, he was sitting alone on the porch of that cottage, staring out at the water. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him. He didn't look up when I arrived. "I came to say goodbye," I told him. "Not to you, but to the part of me that stayed quiet for so long." He didn't answer. His shoulders slumped. And for the first time I didn't care what he thought. I drove away, the lake fading in the rearview mirror. For the first time in 60 years, I felt the weight lift from my chest. The photos, the fake smiles, the lies, they no longer define me. I define me. Now, when I look at my family photos, I see the truth. Not just the years of hollow smiles, but the moment I chose to stop pretending. The moment I stood in front of everyone and said enough. And one day, when my grandchildren ask about that reunion, I'll tell them the story. Not because I want them to remember Richard's betrayal, but because I want them to remember that silence is not strength. That truth, no matter how long it takes, is worth speaking. For 60 years, my smile never reached my eyes. But today it finally does. Because the truth, once spoken, can never be taken back. And sometimes, the loudest revenge is simply refusing to stay silent any longer. If this story spoke to you, subscribe to the channel. Share this video so more voices are heard. Comment below with one line of support for anyone learning to own their face and their story. Your words matter here.